Daniel chapter 5. Now, the chronology of Daniel is interesting. We're just a second, but this is a big jump in time after chapter 4 until we get to chapter 5. And so chapter 5, it says, Belshazzar the king made a great feast to 1,000 of his lords and drank wine before the 1,000. Belshazzar, while he tasted the wine, he commanded to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, that the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines might drink therein. And then they brought the golden vessels that were taken out of the temple, out of the house of God, which was at Jerusalem, and the king and his princes, his wives, his concubines drank in them. And they drank wine, and they praised the gods of gold, of silver, brass, iron, of wood, and of stone. And in the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And then the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loosed, and his knees smote one against another. And the king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, the soothsayers. And the king spake, and he said to the wise men of Babylon, Whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof, shall be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. And then came in all the king's wise men, but they could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof. And then was King Belshazzar greatly troubled, and his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were astonished. Now the queen, by reason of the words of the king and his lords, they came to the banquet house. And the queen spake and said, O king, live forever. Let not the thoughts trouble thee, nor let thy countenance be changed. There is a man in thy kingdom in whom the spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of thy father light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, was found in him, whom the king Nebuchadnezzar thy father, the king, I say, thy father made master of the magicians, astrologers, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. For as much as an excellent spirit and knowledge and understanding, interpreting of dreams, and showing of hard sentences, and dissolving of doubts, were found in the same Daniel, whom the king named Belteshazzar. Now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. And then was Daniel brought in before the king, and the king spake, and he said unto Daniel, Art thou that Daniel, which art the children of captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Jewry? And I have even heard of thee, that the spirit of the gods is in thee, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom is found in thee. And now the wise men, the astrologers, have been brought in before me, that they should read this writing, and make known unto me the interpretation thereof, but they could not show the interpretation of the thing. And I have heard of thee, that thou canst make interpretations and dissolve doubts. Now if thou canst read the writing, and make known to me the interpretation thereof, thou shalt be clothed with scarlet, and have a chain of gold about thy neck, and shalt be the third ruler in the kingdom. And it says, Then Daniel answered and he said before the king, Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Yet I will read the writing unto the king, and make known to him the interpretation. O thou king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father a kingdom, and majesty, and glory, and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages trembled, and they feared before him, whom he would slew, and whom he would he slew, whom he would he kept alive, and whom he would he set up, whom he would he put down. But when his heart was lifted up, and his mind hardened in pride, he was deposed from the kingly throne, and they took his glory from him, and he was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast, and his dwelling was with the wild asses, and they fed him with grass like oxen, and his body was wet with the dew of heaven, till he knew that the Most High God ruled in the kingdom of men, and that he appointeth over whomsoever he will. And thou, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thine heart, though thou knewest all this, but hast lifted up thyself against the Lord of heaven. And they have brought the vessels of his house before thee, and thou and thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines have drunk wine in them. And thou hast praised the gods of silver, of gold, of brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Then was the part of the hand sent from him, and his writing was written. And this is the writing that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. This is the interpretation of the thing. Mene, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Tekel, they are weighed in the balances and are found wanting. Peres, thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and Persians. And then commanded Belshazzar, and they clothed Daniel with scarlet, and put a chain of gold about his neck, and made a proclamation concerning him, that he should be the third ruler in the kingdom. And it says this, And that night was Belshazzar the king of the Chaldeans slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom, being about 62 years old. And so, as I stated earlier, the chronology here is interesting. Chapter 5 takes place chronologically after the events of chapter 7 and chapter 8. And then it takes place about 36 years after the events of chapter 4, which makes sense concerning some of the things that happened. why Daniel was not the very first person consulted, it's a little bit more understanding when you see that this is almost 4 decades after what happened in chapter 4. And so now, interestingly enough, many used to believe that this whole chapter was completely inaccurate for a couple of reasons. Number one, the main reason is because they say, well, Belshazzar was never the king. He's called king in the chapter. He was never actually king. And whereas that's, I guess you could say, technically true, we do know now that his father, who was the last official king of Babylon, Nabonidus, I think is how you pronounce his name, but his father, Nabonidus, was the last official king, but he was very frequently gone and would be gone for very long, extended periods of time. And so while he was gone, Belshazzar would sit on the throne and rule. And so even if he never had the official title of king, he very much was, at least at times, the king of Babylon. And we know for a fact that he was the one who was ruling, again, whether or not he had the official title, he was the one ruling when Babylon fell. Okay, and so all that is historically accurate. And then secondly, several times in the chapter, Nebuchadnezzar is referred to as Belshazzar's father. His father, as I said, was Nabonidus, and more than likely, Nebuchadnezzar was the grandfather of Belshazzar's wife. But nevertheless, this is just how the Babylonians would refer to it. There was really no distinction between grandson, grandfather, that kind of thing, and if he was married into it, it would be just how the Babylonians would talk to refer to him as his father. That's just how that was done. So that's not even anything resembling inaccuracy. And so just to get all that out of the way, there's no historical inaccuracies in Daniel chapter 5. Now, the chapter begins here with Belshazzar, again, ruling because his father was away, and there's all kinds of historical reasons that we know that his father wasn't there, but nevertheless, that's not the point. He's not there. Belshazzar is reigning, and so the chapter begins with him throwing this great grand party, and the text says to thousands of his lords. And we have, again, people will say, well, that's not plausible. Well, we have depictions of other parties, royal celebrations and things being thrown in this part of the world at this time historically, and we see numbers like this. And so again, this just fits in with other things that were being done at the time. Not to keep harping on it, but there's people try consistently to find reasons to doubt, reasons to criticize, reasons to say this isn't accurate, and consistently history proves them wrong and the Bible right. That's how it happens every single time. And so, nevertheless, he throws this grand party, thousands of his lords. We don't know the exact number, but many, thousands, it says. And so we know from verse 30, and this is just an interesting tidbit here, from verse 30 that this party takes place the night that Babylon falls to the Medes and the Persians. And so it says that night Belshazzar was killed, and Darius, we'll talk more about that later, but Darius was made king. Darius the Mede, it calls him. And so this party is taking place the very day that Babylon falls. And so what's interesting about this, and I'll quote Constable here, he says, the invading Medes and Persians, led by Ugbaro, commander of the Persian army, would have already taken the surrounding countryside, and everyone in the city would have known of their intentions. However, the city of Babylon had not fallen to an invading army for 1,000 years because of its strong fortifications. And so the city proper of Babylon had surrounding walls around it that everybody thought these are impenetrable. It's almost kind of like Jericho. You think of the old story of Jericho. And so they thought, whatever, they can be out there. It doesn't matter. They will never take Babylon. And so it shows the brazen nature of this particular party. And so not only is Belshazzar commanding for the vessels from the temple to be brought in, we'll talk about that more in a second, but they're doing this knowing the enemy's out there. And the enemy, again, they're not doing this under some kind of stealth mission. Everybody sees them, everybody knows them, and we know what their intentions are. But with that said, no, we're just going to party. We're going to throw this tremendous, grand party, and we're going to have just a good time. And so, as all that's taking place, again, Belshazzar commands for these vessels that were Nebuchadnezzar had originally taken from the temple. And they bring them in, and they begin to use these for the party. And so as the guests are drinking the night away, it says they praise the gods of gold, silver, brass, iron, wood, and stone. And so what this is, it's more than likely it's Daniel's interpretation of their gods. Right? He's not saying that they're saying, this is a drink to the god of stone, and this is a drink to the god of... No, Daniel is saying that's all that they are. They're praising their gods when all their gods are just gold and silver and brass and iron. They're nothing. They're not serving actual gods. They're serving brass and iron and wood and stone. That's their gods, because idols are nothing. And so to praise their gods, in addition to all this, to praise their false gods, the Babylonian gods, while drinking from the vessels of the temple, show that this whole party was meant to be a statement of status. That's what it was all designed to be. In other words, we're going to party not only while the enemy's out there thinking that they can do something to us, but also we're going to party with the vessels taken from Jerusalem, because what this is it shows that our gods have conquered your gods. Right? Not only are Babylonians supreme, our gods are supreme. And make no mistake about it, that was the common thinking of the day, particularly amongst these pagan nations. If we beat you, that's because our gods are stronger than your gods. Right? That was how people thought. And so not only do they believe that, but they're going to show that by partying in face of the Medes and the Persians, by partying with the vessels of the Jewish people. And so this is all, again, a party to puff up their own prideful spirits. And so God puts a stop to it. As they're partying, it says that this man's hand appears and begins to write on, interestingly enough, it says the plaster on the wall. And by the way, at ancient Babylon, when it was excavated, they found what they believed to be kind of a throne room with plaster on the walls, right? And so this is, again, historical findings that are just verifying Scripture. But nevertheless, it begins to write in the plaster on the walls, and obviously that is quite the sight. Added on top of that is the fact that probably most of these people are at least a little inebriated, right? And so they're already not thinking very clearly. And then you see that, and obviously to say that they were scared is putting it lightly. In fact, the text goes so far to say that Belshazzar's knees were literally knocking together. Not metaphor. This isn't a cartoon. This is his knees are actually knocking together because he's so afraid. And so he cries out for the wise men to come to read the words, to interpret the writing. And he says, whoever does this, I'm going to lavishly gift them. I'll put the robe on them. I'll make them third in the kingdom, right? I'm going to do all these things. But again, the familiar story, they can't, right? We've seen this time and time again already. They couldn't do it. They were unable to do it. And so there's been all kinds of questions about this. The words that we see later on in the chapter as far as what was written are in Aramaic. And so it could simply be that when God wrote on the wall, he wrote in Aramaic, or it could be that Daniel simply translated what was written and wrote it in Aramaic. We don't know. We can't say, one way or another. But there's questions. Why couldn't they read this? They could read Aramaic. Why couldn't they read this? And so it's possible, and honestly I think maybe likely, that it's not that they couldn't read the words, but it was nonsense to them. When we get to it later on, we'll talk about this. They could read it, but it just, those combination of words meant nothing to them. I don't know why this hand appeared, and I don't know why that hand wrote that. It doesn't make any sense. And so they needed somebody to come in, not necessarily to read it, but to both read and interpret it. And again, the interpretation becomes the key thing here. And so this is where the queen comes in. Now, the queen is, it could possibly be Belshazzar's wife. It never says, it just says queen. I think it's probably more than likely his mother. But nevertheless, the queen comes in, whichever woman this was. She comes in. She's told what's happened, and then she comes to not only inform the king, but to comfort the king. Again, he's very scared. And I have to say this. He's rightfully scared. It would scare me if I just saw a hand appear and start writing on the wall. And so, I'm not knocking the guy. It's a scary thing. And so she comes in, and she tells him, she says, "There is a man in thy kingdom, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, is found in him." And so, again, the 36-year gap shows maybe why Belshazzar didn't immediately think, somebody needs to go get Daniel. Now, he clearly knows who Daniel is. I think that's clear later on. At the very least, has heard of Daniel. Maybe doesn't know him personally. but he is at the very least heard of Daniel. But the queen, again, assuming it's his mother, she would be well old enough to remember Daniel coming in, interpreting various things for Nebuchadnezzar, and not only interpreting, but always getting it right. And so the queen comes in, and she can immediately put these things together. Oh, there's this strange occurrence that needs an interpretation. Well, I know somebody who focuses on strange occurrences that need interpretation, and he always gets it right. And so basically she tells him, you need to go get Daniel. And she tells him that much. She says, now let Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. And so it's interesting that his reputation is still to the point where the queen here has no doubt of Daniel's capability to do this. Now, the only way in which I would say she's wrong is that she says he will show the interpretation. She was still putting her faith in Daniel, whenever Daniel would have been the first to say, I'm not going to do it, God's going to do it. God just gives me the interpretation. I'm just his mouthpiece. That's all I am. And so Nebuchadnezzar finally came to understand that. Obviously, she doesn't understand this fully, but nevertheless, the king does this. He calls him in and tells him the same thing he told everybody else. If you do this, I'm going to just gift you lavishly, clothed with scarlet, have a chain of gold about thy neck. You'll be the third ruler in the kingdom. Well, Daniel wasn't interested in all that. He tells him, no, you keep your gifts. I don't want any of that, but I will interpret the writing. And so again, he's confident. And again, he's confident because he knows how powerful his God is, not because he's confident in his own knowledge or his own ability to interpret. Now, what I find so fascinating about Daniel here is before just going right into saying, well, here's what the writing is, here's what it means, he tells a little story. And so he tells them about Nebuchadnezzar, right? And he says he had a kingdom and majesty and glory and honor. And for the majesty that he gave him, all people, nations, languages, they all trembled and they feared before him. And so Belshazzar, he's saying, Belshazzar, think about Nebuchadnezzar. Think about his glory. Think about how all the people and nations trembled before Nebuchadnezzar. Now, here's what you got to remember, is that Nebuchadnezzar didn't do this on his own. God gave it to him. God gave him that glory. God gave him that kingdom. All the people trembling before him, they were doing that because of God, not because of Nebuchadnezzar. And again, remember that Nebuchadnezzar himself forgot that until God humbled him. And he humbled it in such a way that Nebuchadnezzar never forgot about this. And so the key thing about all this is Belshazzar knows this. It's not as if this is information that was just forgotten long ago. Yes, it's been a long time since those events happened, but it's not as if these things were just forgotten by the nation. Oh, remember that one time Nebuchadnezzar went crazy for 7 years and ate grass? That's not something people forget. Belshazzar knows this. He fully is aware of Nebuchadnezzar's glory, his downfall, and his uprising again, and would have been told, if not by Nebuchadnezzar himself, would have been told why that all happened. Because of God. Because of the glory that God gave him. And so, in spite of knowing this, and this is, again, another thing that makes this chapter so interesting. In spite of knowing all this, he tried to pretend as if he were not just the king of Babylon, but a God himself. That's what he's trying to do. I'll come back to that thought here in just a moment. So, with vessels made to worship the one true God, they praised false gods, which see not, nor hear, nor know. And the God, this is such an, I love this verse. And the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. And so Daniel's telling them, listen how ridiculous this is. You're sitting here drinking vessels designed and created for worshiping the only God who actually exists. And you're using those vessels to give praise to false gods of your own making. And in doing so, you're demeaning the very God who gave you the breath that's in your lungs right now. And that's who you want to put down. And that's who you want to demean. And so because of all this, it says that God sent his hand against Belshazzar. And so this is very clearly a judgment. And so verse 24 says, then was the part of his hand sent from him, and the writing was written. And so why did this come upon you? Before I tell you what it means, let me tell you why it's here. It's here because of your pride. It's here because just like Nebuchadnezzar before you, you tried to beat your own chest and think how great you were instead of understanding and acknowledging the God who has made all this possible. And so with all that said, he said, here's what the writing says. The words again, Mene, Mene, Tekel, Upharsin. Now, why I think it's probably likely that the other wise men were able to at least read these words. Is these are just Aramaic words. They're by and large, all of these words refer to some kind of unit of measurement. And so they could see all these units of measurement up on the wall, but that was nonsensible to them. Why would, of all the things that a magical hand appearing in the sky would start to write, why would he write that? Why would that be the writing? And so why Daniel was necessary is because Daniel could understand what God was saying. God gave them words, but Daniel had a heart for God to know what God meant. And so taking these words together, the interpretation is essentially, God hath numbered thy kingdom and finished it. Thou art weighed in the balances and art found wanting. Thy kingdom is divided and given to the Medes and the Persians. And so you would imagine, now unfortunately the Bible doesn't tell us what Belshazzar's reaction was this, other than just to say, well, okay, I told you I'd give you the gifts, here's the gifts, right? He does that. But you would like to think at least that suddenly things started to click. Belshazzar knows the Medes and the Persians are outside his window. He knows that. And again, he knows of the stories of Nebuchadnezzar. Again, whether or not he knew Daniel personally, there's not a chance that the name Daniel has not come up in the life of Belshazzar. And so he knows this man, and again, Daniel is an older man by this point, standing there as a wizened older man, and I would like to have at least an understanding of what Belshazzar's reaction was to this, but nevertheless, what's interesting about all this is likely, again, we're not given the exact timing down to the minute or the hour, but likely as the words of this judgment were pouring out of the mouth of Daniel, the means of the judgment, the Medes and the Persians, were pouring into the city of Babylon, probably at those very moments. And so true to his word, like I said, true to his word, Belshazzar gives them all the gifts that Daniel didn't want anyway, but he gives them it anyways. But more importantly, the text says that later that night, Belshazzar, the king of the Chaldeans, was slain, and Darius the Median took the kingdom. And so thus the majesty and the might of the Babylonian Empire was ended this very night. Was ended the night where Belshazzar tried to make the gods of Babylon somehow comparable or better to the God of the Jews. There is no comparison. One is actually God, the others are false gods of their own making. And so God let him know real quick who was actually in power, who was actually sovereign, who was actually God. And so that night, which is actually this night, we know it. There was question as far as when this was. This night is referred to by many different ancient historians. Belshazzar dies and Babylon falls. And we know the exact date. This was October 13th, 539 BC. Several different people referred to this. And what is interesting is that Cyrus, who was over the Medes, or the Persians, he sends his army, led by the man we referenced earlier, Ugbaru, I believe is his name. Cyrus sends his army, and they actually cut off the water from the Euphrates River. The Euphrates River flowed through the city of Babylon. And so the walls were kind of built up over the river. And so what he does is he diverts the river Euphrates into an old kind of washed up marsh. And basically they divert it up until the point where his soldiers were able to wade through. Most say that the water was about waist deep, but they could walk through it, which was the point. And so they divert the waters. He sends in his army. They wade through the waters of the Euphrates, and they go under the walls. That's not what anybody expected. And so they ended up going under the walls of the city of Babylon. They enter the city, and they conquer it. It was relatively quick, right? So nobody expected them to get in, and so they were utterly unprepared once they did. And Belshazzar was killed, and Darius takes over. So again, the point of chapter 5 is the same thing that we have seen now several times over. The kings of the world pitted against the God of the universe. right? They try to think themselves high and mighty. They try to think themselves lifted up. They try to think of themselves even as godlike themselves. And this was not uncommon. The Egyptians typically worshiped Pharaoh as God or as a god. And so it was not uncommon for pagan nations to see their ruler, their king, their emperor, whatever word you want to use, as some kind of deity. And so that's how they came to view themselves. But over and over and over again, we have seen that pitted against God and God being victorious. And so they owe, and the interesting thing is that they owe everything to the God who they're trying to demean, to the God who they're trying to compare themselves against. They owe everything to him because he's the God who gives them breath. And just as easily as he gives it, he can take it away because breaths, like kingdoms, are his to give. Right? And so what is interesting about this particular night is that God says, Belshazzar, not only am I determining that now your breaths are gone, so is Babylon. And I control both. Right? I control both the breath in your lungs. I control how long you live. I control how long the kingdom lasts. I control who the next king is going to be. I control who the next empire is going to be, and so on and so forth. Again, what is the overwhelming theme of the book of Daniel is that our God is sovereign. That's what we see over and over and over. Now, just as one little tiny note before we close, verse 31, Darius the Mede took the kingdom. There's all kinds of questions about who this is. It's hard to say definitively, but what I think is probably likely is that Darius became kind of a moniker for the king. In other words, that wasn't his name, more or less, that was his title. It's, sort of like Pharaoh. Whoever was the Pharaoh was called Pharaoh. Pharaoh wasn't his name. Pharaoh was a title. And so it's possible, plausible, that Darius was more of a title than an actual name. And people try to put it on different people. It's possible that Cyrus took over as kind of the overwhelming king, but it's possible that this man Darius was Cyrus. Some people think that. It's possible that this man was the guy who just took over the city of Babylon and not necessarily the entire nation. But nevertheless, who it is isn't really all that important as to understand that whoever it was is the man that God deemed to take over because he said, now Belshazzar's time is over. And it's Darius' time to begin. And so that's how we need to understand it. All right.